Kia ora koutou, ko Tim Dare aho. I'm a professor in the philosophy department at the University of Auckland. Today I'm going to talk about COVID vaccination passports. So earlier this year in February and March there was a lot of talk about vaccination passports, and what I'm interested in is both the ethics and some of the practical issues around the proposals to have such passports. So I think in late February 2021, Air New Zealand announced that it was going to trial a global digital travel pass, and they put out a press release, and one of the things the press release included was this statement: customers will be able to create a digital health wallet linked to their e-passport. That's the digital passport that they would have. Once travellers have been tested and or vaccinated, labs will securely send data to the individual's app. It then checks requirements for travel against the data, and customers who meet those travel requirements will be given the green tick to travel. Now, it's worth perhaps just starting by pointing out just what this proposal assumes. So we see at the end there the suggestion that people who meet the requirements of the app will be able to travel. They'll have the green tick to travel. But actually the IATA, that's the International Air Travel Association passport, relies upon quite a significant structure, or underpinning structure, which is as yet unbuilt. So first there will be, it requires a global registry of health requirements. That is, it assumes that someone has put together a comprehensive and accurate statement of the health requirements of all of the countries who are involved using the app, what they require for passengers coming into their countries. It then requires a global registry of testing vaccination centres. Just notice these are both global, so it's quite a dramatic project. So that would be a full list of centres which would identify testing centres and labs at the departure location, so the places that people were leaving from, which met the standards for testing and vaccination of those travellers' destination countries. So you have both a list of the facilities, the approved facilities and countries of origin, and a list of how they map on to the requirements of potential countries of destination. You would have a lab app of some description which would allow authorised labs and test centres to securely share test and vaccination certificates. So I would go to one of these authorised labs, I would have my vaccination and a test, and the results of that test and the fact I'd had the vaccination would be loaded up to the app automatically, probably, or by some automated system, or digital system, I should say. Then on the passenger's phone, they would have the actual passport would be a digital passport, which will receive test and vaccination certificates, verify that they were sufficient for their itinerary, that is, they were sufficient for the journey they were planning to take given the requirements of their country of origin and country of destination, and they would share testing or vaccination certificates with airlines and authorities to facilitate travel. So roughly you would have a full list of all of the requirements around the world that countries required for people to enter their countries. You would have a full list of testing and vaccination centres. You would have this app which would allow labs to load information onto a user's phone, and the digital passport itself would be something which would be on my phone, and then I could show probably the immigration officers at the country of destination, and it would have all that information available. Now I just want to pause and emphasise what a dramatic project that is. So there's no reason to think that it would be an easy task to build either of those global registries. We know there's a great deal of variation between the requirements of countries for travellers. We know that there will be obviously a range of testing and vaccination centres. All of that information will need to be put together, and we will need to know that the information is accurate and that the centres which appear are in fact ones we're prepared to rely on, and so on and so on. And so it's just worth noting, I think, that this is really quite a large bit of infrastructure. And if we think about the difficulties we've had, even in countries like New Zealand, where we have a fairly sophisticated health system, the digitisation of health records is quite far advanced, but nonetheless we've faced huge challenges in having digital health records that we can share across centres that work reliably. So we shouldn't underestimate how difficult this will be when we're trying to do it across different countries with different systems, different incentives to cooperate, and so on and so on. And finally, just on this is not quite an infrastructure matter that needs to be built, but it's something that it's important to note. Remember, the press release says, travellers who satisfy this requirement will get the green tick to travel. Well, that's probably a bit quick. The International Air Travel Association pass will depend on acceptance by governments. There's no guarantee that travellers who have the app, the digital passport, will in fact be admitted to a country on the basis of the passport. All of those decisions are made by governments, not by private industry. So one of the curious things about these proposals is that a lot of the proposals for COVID passports have come from private industries, from airlines and so on. And one might wonder what guarantee they can give, actually, that the models they're building will gain the acceptance or approval of immigration authorities. Now, the airline, so Air New Zealand and the International Air Travel Association, may have taken some comfort from the fact that in New Zealand, the Minister of Health, Chris Hipkins, said, I think this is early March, I can't read the date on that slide at the moment, but that he thought that COVID-19 vaccine passports were almost an inevitability within a year. So they may have thought, well, yes, something's happening. There's some commitment to accepting a process a bit like this. Whether it'll be precisely in the form of the IATA travel app or not, we can't be certain, but at least they may think there's some kind of sign on. Now just again, it's interesting to note that New Zealand has recently begun the travel bubble with Australia. I'm very pleased. I have a daughter who's managed to come home. That travel bubble, notice, hasn't relied upon vaccine passports. It has relied upon the confidence of the two governments that travellers are coming from places where there is no COVID. And so the arrangement with the travel bubble between New Zealand and Australia is that travel is free. You can travel between the countries, provided there's no notice that there has been a COVID outbreak. So we've seen cases in Perth, for instance, where there has been a cluster of COVID cases, and in those instances the travel bubble has been interrupted. No talk here about travel passports. What we relied upon is the absence of COVID in the countries of origin. Now, of course, that may change once the populations of the two countries and other countries become vaccinated. So once the reason we would be confident that there's unlikely to be COVID is that most of the population is vaccinated, then vaccination passports may make more sense. But it's interesting to note that we've already opened our borders in a limited way to people from Australia, not because we're relying on COVID passports, but because we're relying upon the absence of COVID. All right, so that's the background. We have this proposal that there be these passports. In New Zealand, the clearest suggestions have come from the airlines. As I say, I think we should bear in mind that there's quite a lot of work to be done on the underpinning infrastructure before we thought those passports would work, but we do have some words of encouragement from government. Now, what I want to do in the rest of this brief talk is talk about what I think the ethical issues around the COVID passports are, and also some practical issues, and then finally talk a little bit about and what we might do to try and address those concerns. And in the middle, I'll talk briefly about an existing a vaccination passport and see how it compares with these proposals. So what are the ethical risks around COVID passports? I think an absolutely crucial issue that we need to settle is what activities the vaccination passports will be used for. So we've seen in some countries, so Israel, for instance, has a vaccine passport, the Green Pass, and the Green Pass is by design not just a travel pass. It is a pass which has been used to allow people to enter all sorts of situations in which there are large numbers of people and where you might be worried about the transmission of COVID. So in those cases, there have been the passports are used more generally than travel. Now, my inclination is that the level of ethical risk depends upon the range of activities that the passport will be required to access and to participate in. If it's just travel, and if it were just travel between, say, Australia and New Zealand, then it's not an insignificant interference with people's liberty, with the kinds of things people want to do. But we might live with some worries about it, and I'll cash out those worries in a bit more detail in a moment. But if these passports became necessary to participate in work, for instance, if you couldn't go to your employment without a passport, if they became necessary to participate in education, you can imagine educational institutions, so universities and schools, where you have large numbers or relatively large numbers of people in small spaces. They might be interested in using these passports to allow students to enrol. As we've seen in Israel, they're used in concerts and so on and so on. Now, the suggestion here is that the broader the range of activities the passport is required for, and the more essential activities, so activities which are really essential to going about an ordinary life, earning a living, participating in education, maybe perhaps participating in religious events and so on, those things that people put a significant store in, the more events and the more significant events that the passport is required for, the more significant the ethical worries they raise are. So the smaller the number of activities they regulate or they're required for, and the more trivial those activities are, the less we would be ethically worried. Now, why worry? Well, there are a few obvious concerns. Perhaps the most obvious are issues around equality of access. Now, some of these will be because of unequal access to vaccines. So if in order to get a passport and participate in whatever activities the passport is regulating or required for, you have to be vaccinated, then of course we'll need to make sure that vaccination is available to those people who require a passport. And indeed, Chris Hipkins, in his remarks, says you couldn't require people to have a passport to do things and then not make vaccines available to them. Now, there are both global, so international and local, domestic versions of this worry. Some of them are around vaccine availability. So we've already seen that political units like the EU have restricted the access to vaccines. They want to make sure their citizens are vaccinated. There's been accusations of vaccine nationalism. Countries like the US have tried to buy up vaccines. And it's very clear that some poorer countries simply cannot purchase vaccines for their citizens. And even if they can get the vaccines, they may lack the expensive infrastructure to roll them out and make it available to their citizens. So I think there's no question at the moment that there is global inequality around the availability of vaccines. We haven't yet produced enough vaccine and worked out how to distribute it on an equitable basis to make sure that anyone who wants to be vaccinated can be vaccinated. Then there will be similar issues raised by problems of prioritisation. So here in New Zealand, I think we still do have some issues around vaccine availability. We haven't got sufficient stocks to vaccinate everyone, though it doesn't seem to be regarded as a pressing issue because, of course, we have low rates of COVID. But here there are prioritisation principles being worked out. Health workers and frontline workers will be vaccinated before low-risk members of the general population. Older people are likely to be vaccinated first, and so on. And so those prioritisation rules will also raise issues about equality of access. There will be people who are further down the line, the queue for vaccines, and they may have to wait longer. And again, the more significant the burden of being unvaccinated and so not having a passport, the more significant those prioritisations might be. And we've already seen issues where Olympic athletes have been allowed to jump the queue and so on. So you can imagine lots of issues around prioritisation, and they will flow into the vaccine passports simply because whatever you need a passport to do, you will need to wait in line for your vaccination. I should just, as a footnote here, notice that earlier in this discussion, earlier in the discussion of vaccine passports, there were discussion of immunisation passports, where the idea was you would get something which looked like a passport in the way I've described if you could show that you were immune to COVID. There were worries about that because it seemed to have perverse incentives for people to expose themselves to COVID. We'll talk about some of the issues here in the next point where I'm talking about practical issues. Of course, one of the worries about the immunity passports was a lack of certainty around just what level of immunity was bestowed by being exposed. But so just a footnote at this point. There's another obvious problem with access, and that is that some people will be unable to become vaccinated. So there are bound to be contraindicators, so health conditions which will make it inappropriate for some people to be vaccinated. And those people, presumably, will not be able to get a vaccine passport, at least as we've described the vaccine passport being proposed by the IATA. Now, one of the things I'm going to suggest is that we would need to make alternative arrangements for these people. Of course, presumably we all know one very good reason to get vaccinated is precisely because we know there are people in the community who can't, and so those of us who can should get vaccinated, so that by doing so we reduce the risk to people who can't get vaccinated. And again, there's a sort of a side discussion here. Of course, there will be some people who don't get vaccinated because they don't want to get vaccinated, so there'll be vaccine deniers or people who think the pandemic is a conspiracy or what have you. Now, it's not that we should be indifferent to those people, I think, but one thing we might think is that at least they've chosen, whatever disadvantage they suffer by reason of not being vaccinated and so not having access to a vaccine passport, will have been a risk or a burden they've taken on willingly, and so the ethical issues are a little different. Just again, another footnote here. Most vaccines require something in the order of high 80s or low 90% coverage to be effective. So with most vaccines, we don't need 100% of the people to be vaccinated. If a sufficient proportion of a population is vaccinated, then the potential host for vaccine-preventable diseases is lowered, and so the chances of those diseases getting afoot and replicating is reduced. So there's a certain level where vaccine-preventable diseases die out because they can't replicate because there are not enough potential hosts around. Now, that number, that percentage, as I say, is almost always something under 100%. It's often, 95 is a pretty high percentage. Now, what that means is that in any community for a disease with that sort of profile, we can tolerate 5% of people being unvaccinated. And by tolerate, I mean we get the benefits of the vaccine even though 5% of the community are unvaccinated. Now, if that 5% includes principal anti-vaxxers, people who don't want to get vaccinated, then I think we can just ignore them. We can just think, well, that is, we pro-vaccination people can just think, well, we think you should get vaccinated, but actually it doesn't make much difference if you don't, so we will just live with your decision not to vaccinate. Now notice, if the combination of people who don't get vaccinated because they don't want to, they're vaccine deniers, let's suppose, and people who can't get vaccinated is more than the percentage of unvaccinated people we can tolerate while getting the benefit of the vaccine, then we have a different problem. And of course, we may want to put pressure on the principled anti-vaxxers if the bulk of or if the remainder of the people who are unvaccinated are people who simply can't get vaccinated on health reasons. So all of these will create equity issues, and the idea will be that those who are unable to obtain the vaccines, are unable to be vaccinated, will be unable to obtain a vaccine passport, and they will be disadvantaged. Linking back to the first point, the broader the range of disadvantages and the more fundamental they are, the more essential they are to an ordinary life or a good life, the more ethical reason we'll have to worry about those issues. So one very significant issue here, I think, essentially what comes out of the pairing of these two problems, that we have reason to be concerned that vaccine passports will stop people doing important things, and we need to recognise that people will not all be able to get a vaccine passport either globally or locally. Now, there are also a range of issues here around privacy and security. On the Air New Zealand, the travel pass, they describe the IATA app as a place to store all your health credentials digitally in one place. Now again, this is an enormously optimistic and I think frankly misleading description. We haven't managed to do that even with our health records digital health records maintained by hospitals and GPs and so on. There's no particular reason to think that Air New Zealand is suddenly going to crack it and get all my health credentials digitised and held in one place. That's not going to happen. And of course, we may not be comfortable if it did. So I've argued elsewhere that we ought to be a little less concerned about privacy than we are. I think privacy is often used to shield improper conduct, and we should target the improper conduct. And if we did, we would be less worried about privacy. So the example I use is sexual orientation. There was a time when there was discrimination and stigmatisation around sexual orientation. When that was true, people had very good reasons to keep their sexual orientation secret, to guarantee people privacy around those issues. Once that discrimination and stigmatisation lessens, there's less reason for people to be worried about keeping that information private. And so I would hope these days there's no particular reason for people to keep their sexual orientation private. One would hope we've moved beyond that. Now, I may be being a bit optimistic. But so I think, I'm a bit of a privacy skeptic, but nonetheless, many people would be worried about handing an organisation like the International Air Travel Association, who after all are not an organisation who is structured to keep information private, we might worry about the security of those issues. We might just go through the Privacy Act, for instance, in New Zealand. The Privacy Act in New Zealand wouldn't allow them to have all of my health credentials. Presumably they don't want it. They would only be allowed to have the health credentials that are necessary for the purpose and so on. So this is all, I think both undesirable, that all my health credentials would be held, and a bit implausible, actually. All right, so those are some ethical risks. I'm interested in hearing if there are more. So people should feel to contact me on my university email address if they think I've missed some, if they see this. I now want to turn to a different kind of risk. So I think there are also a range of risks around the reliability of vaccine passports. Now, ethics and practical matters. So ethics and practical matters are not entirely distinct. So there's no reason to think that there's a list of ethical risks and a list of practical risk, and they don't meet. So many of these will connect with the ethical risks. But one obvious point to make is that vaccine passports are intended to show that holders have been vaccinated. Now, even putting aside risks around fraud, so worries that someone might have a passport even though they haven't been vaccinated, and that is surely possible, but just bracketing that for a moment, there could be lots of issues around that. There are a variety of vaccines, and there's as yet no clear reason to think that they all perform equally against all of the strains of COVID, and so I'm going to bring this up now. There are also new strains of COVID that have emerged, and they may continue to do so. So the point here is that even if you have been vaccinated, using one of the approved vaccines, so one of the things which would appear in that global list of approved vaccines, there may not be reason to believe that your vaccine protects you against all strains of the disease. And what that would mean, of course, is that authorities admitting you to a country, or the passenger sitting next to you on the aeroplane, or even though I can be confident everyone on the aeroplane has a COVID passport, let's suppose, I wouldn't have reason to think that though their possession of the passport shows that they were not vulnerable or susceptible to some new variety of the strain, or that the vaccination they had protected them. So in that case, then just what the passport evidences, what it gives people to reason to believe about the passport holder would be unclear. And of course, we know that no vaccine is 100% effective. So there have always been cases of people who've had vaccinations who nonetheless catch the disease. And so there will be cases, I don't think there's any question, that people will have been vaccinated. Their susceptibility to some strains will on the evidence we've seen so far, will be reduced. They will be a significantly lower risk, but the risk that they bring the vaccine into a country will not be reduced to zero. And so again, we won't quite know what to make of the fact that someone has a vaccine passport. We won't know whether that shows that they really are they pose no risk of bringing the virus into a country. And then there's a sort of broader issue here, I think. The fact that we're calling these things passports, vaccine passports, is, I think, no mistake. We're trading on assumptions or beliefs we have about regular passports. And what I believe about my regular passport, and I assume what the immigration authorities believe when I produce my passport at a foreign border, is that the information in the passport is accurate, my identity has been confirmed through a robust process. I have to send my photos in, people have to sign the back of them saying they're me, I have to produce a birth certificate, so on and so on, all those things we do to produce a passport. When I fly to the US or Australia and the Australian or US immigration authorities see my New Zealand passport, they are relying on the fact that they can be confident, or the Australian or US government can be confident that the New Zealand government has a robust passport system. And so the effectiveness of our regular passports depends a lot, maybe almost completely, on that undergirding infrastructure, which says that the passports accurately evidence whatever they're meant to evidence. So they show that I'm me, they show where I've travelled recently, they show that I'm entitled to hold a passport in a country which has a robust system, and so on and so on. So what makes regular passports work is that substantial institutional backing and the international agreements around them. So this comes back a little bit to the first slide when I was trying to emphasise just what you would need to be in the background behind the travel passports. So, but all of those things are lacking for vaccination passports. Notice the IATA passport, the one Air New Zealand is talking of using, has been put together by an airline association. Now, all credit to them, I suppose. I have nothing against the IATA, but the IATA is not the New Zealand government or the Australian government or the US government. They don't have that kind of infrastructure. And so we will never probably have reason to believe that travel passports have the degree of institutional backing and guarantee that the person who has the passport is the person it describes. They are the person who had the tests, that their identity has been verified, and so on, that the tests they've had are the ones which are approved. We're always likely to be slightly less certain about that than we are with regular passports. And of course we do know there are cases where regular passports are faked and so on, but I think this is just likely to be a much more significant issue with these passports. Now actually, so I may have misdescribed this. It's not that I think there's a greater chance that the travel pass will be produced fraudulently. There probably is a greater chance of that, but that's not the real issue. I think the real issue is that they just lack this background infrastructure, the institutional infrastructure which makes regular passports work. So there's no shared standards, there are no identification checks, record keeping, etc., all of those things. And there are probably other things. So what I'm trying to draw attention to here, or get people to think about, is we call these things passports, but what are the differences between the app I'll have on my phone and the booklet, the black booklet with the digital chip and so on that I use when I travel around the country? All right, so those are some risks of reliability of vaccine passports. Now, there has been a response to some of these concerns, and that is to say, look, this is all, you people who are worrying about vaccine passports, don't you see we've already done this? And the example people point to is the yellow card. And so there's a WHO, World Health Organization yellow card. What it is an international certificate to record inoculations against yellow fever, cholera, typhus and smallpox. And the yellow card has been around since the 1930s. So we already have this document. It's a paper document. People who go to certain countries require it. Some travellers my age may remember on their early trips overseas when you needed to get a list of inoculations and you had to carry some guarantee of it. So I've had one of these actually a way back. But there are differences. And so the idea is here that, well, haven't we already shown that we can manage vaccination or inoculation passports? What's the difference between the yellow card and the proposed COVID vaccination passports? Well, I think there are a few. One is, one this is not a difference, but an objection to that line of argument. You might think, well, okay, we have had the yellow card for a while, but actually it may pose exactly the same ethical and institutional risks that I'm suggesting the COVID vaccination would pose. Perhaps, and I think it's not at all unlikely, that people who are resident in the countries where those diseases are a threat, where there's fever, yellow fever, cholera, typhus, smallpox, where those diseases either were, in the case of smallpox, or are in the case of the other ones, are still a risk. Though people from those countries may suffer significant disadvantages. If they can't get inoculations for one reason or other, either because they have health reasons or because the infrastructure isn't there for them to get the inoculation, then they may have exactly the sorts of problems that I described earlier on. They may essentially be discriminated against because they can't satisfy a requirement which allows them to do things that other people can. So there may be the same kind of concerns, so consistency arguments cut both ways is the point. So you can't defend vaccine passports by saying, oh, look at the yellow card, without showing that actually the yellow card has somehow avoided these risks. And if it has avoided those risks, it would be interesting to see how. There are other differences, and that is that those diseases are serious, but they're rare, and they're endemic to certain areas. The scale of the COVID pandemic, that is, makes an ethical difference. It makes the ethical risks associated with people being unable to get a travel document or a document which allows them to participate in a larger range of activities. It makes those ethical risks more pressing. Some of the risks here, so the risks around privacy and security, for instance, and our general capacity to put these requirements in at scale, link specifically to the fact that this is a digital passport. Now, that is, we can impose these burdens at a much wider rate, much wider scale, across a larger population than perhaps we can with the yellow card. Notice too, it raises some special issues about access to the digital technology. So earlier in the COVID pandemic, when we were talking about having apps, contract tracing apps, one of the issues which came up was whether everyone would have, or some people would not be able to get access to the technology to have a certain kind of contact tracing app. And probably the capacity to access the technology to use those tracing apps depends upon socioeconomic status to some condition. So you may be discriminating or placing burdens on people who are poor. And we know in many countries socioeconomic status tracks or ethnicity, and so you may be discriminating on the basis of ethnicity. And so those things are tricky, and they will be tricky in this case too, I suspect. And notice finally, to get back to the point on the last slide, the yellow card has the backing of international health regulations that specify conditions for validity. Now, I'm slightly suspicious that those conditions won't be as robust as I would like. I think given the rarity of the diseases, it's rather unlikely that we have the kind of security and checking and shared standards that we would desire. But nonetheless, on the face of it, the yellow card has solved that problem, or purports to have solved that problem. All right, so those are some ethical concerns, some practical concerns, and a bit of a response to the haven't we already done this point. So what should we do to reduce the risks? So notice I'm not saying that we shouldn't have vaccine passports. I think that remains to be seen whether they're the best response. So it remains to be seen whether the Minister of Health, Chris Hipkins, is right, whether these do become required. We shall see. But suppose we do want to implement them, we do want to make them widely available, what should we do? Well, the first thing I think, we do have to settle the shared background standards. We have to make clear just what those standards are. Now, notice that this is a task for governments, not private industries. So this will be the sorts of things which say, in order to get a passport, you have to have a vaccination. The vaccination has to be one of the ones on this approved list. We know which varieties it protects against and for how long, and so on and so on. We hope, I'll come to this in a second. So those standards, I think, really have to be settled. So settling those standards would allow vaccination passports to look a bit more like regular passports. We'd have to demonstrate that it's possible to build the background infrastructure, the lists of testing stations and so on and so on. Sorry, I cut that bullet point off. We'd have to show that we can actually do that. So we have that list on the IATA site and the Air New Zealand site, but actually, so I suspect those are very big tasks, those global lists of vaccinations, of travel regulations and so on. So we'd have to show that we can do it. We would have to specify limitations on their use. So I think, again, a very important thing is to make sure that we know what the vaccine passport would be used for. Now, I think this may be trickier than it sounds. So I think vaccine passports, if they become common, just will be very tempting for a wide range of organisations, groups, or what have you, to use in order to control participation in events. And so you would have to outlaw it for some uses, I think, unless you really were comfortable that the vaccine passport would be required for a significant range of uses, say to participate in education, in large educational institutions. If you're not comfortable with that, then you would need to somehow ban it. You might be able to do that with an institution the size of the University of Auckland or other big New Zealand universities. It might be much trickier in small groups, churches and so on, what have you. It would be harder to know what they were using, but I think we need to limit their scope because, as I said at the beginning, I think the broader the scope, the more significant those ethical risks become. One issue here that might make us think that a lot of the talk about vaccine passports has just been premature. So who knows whether Chris Hipkins will be proven right, but you might think he's jumping the gun because a lot of the significant barriers to the vaccine passports are actually caused by a lack of certainty about what strains of disease are out there and how they might develop, about how effective the vaccines are under what conditions, upon what the contraindicators are, who can't be vaccinated. And so one issue is, I think, that the science around COVID and the vaccinations is still emerging. We actually don't have answers to all of the questions that we really need in order to settle some of those questions that I've mentioned, to know what it means to have a vaccination and therefore to have a vaccination passport. So one thing we might do is just wait actually until we're a bit more on top of the science before we do this. Notice in the meantime we can rely upon the sorts of arrangements that are being made between Australia and New Zealand. If we're confident that there's a low risk of COVID being brought in, because we're confident the incidence of COVID in certain countries is low, we can proceed on that basis before we leap to passports. So saying wait is not saying don't travel. It might make travel between a wider range of countries difficult, but actually I think it's going to be difficult anyway, because as I say, I think making those arrangements between governments is much more difficult than people are letting on here. I can imagine a vaccine passport arranged between New Zealand and Australia. We're already being pretty cooperative and showing high trust in one another, and so we may trust the vaccine passports, the infrastructure that's in place. But of course, once you broaden this to more and more countries with much greater differences between the background operating systems and the cultures, that will all become more difficult, I think. We need to ensure that there are options for those who can't obtain a passport or access the technology that digital versions require. So if vaccine passports are going to be required for a wide range of activities, then, as Chris Hipkins said, it would be unfair to say to people you can't participate in this important activity or an activity which is significant in a lot of people's lives if you don't have a passport. If you can't get it, either because there are resourcing issues and the vaccine's not available in your area, or the prioritisation arrangements have left you at the end of a very long queue, or if you have health reasons. So some answers here might just be to make paper versions available, but of course those won't cure those issues about not being able to get vaccinated. So we need to settle that, I think. We need to identify and address inequality of access to vaccines. So a version of the same point. We need to make sure, if it's a condition of doing these things, that you have a passport and you can only get a passport if you've been vaccinated, then we'd better make sure the vaccinations are available and available at either low or no cost. So we better make sure there are no barriers to getting vaccinated. And so I think that's tricky both on resourcing grounds, but also because of the issues about some people won't be able to get vaccinated. So I think at least those things just have to be settled before we introduce vaccine passports, if we're going to reduce or address the ethical risks. Again, there may be other things, and so I'm interested in what others think. That's my list at the moment. Just let me finish by saying, so that doesn't lead me again to think we shouldn't have vaccine passports, but I do think the difficulties around them have been dramatically understated. I think it's rather surprising they're being pushed by airlines and not governments, and it might be that a government realises just how difficult this would be. So I think we need to address those ethical and practical risks before we identify them, and until we do, talk of vaccination passports, I think, is premature. Thank you.